I remember October 2008 as if it were yesterday. A case that began as just another police incident ended up turning into a cruel spectacle, broadcast almost in real time across the entire country. But before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss upcoming videos. If you're already subscribed, then let's continue. Four teenagers were held captive inside a modest apartment in a low-income residential complex in Santo André in the greater Sao Paulo area. What no one could have imagined was that those walls would become the stage for one of the most shocking and controversial crimes in Brazil's recent history. There were more than 100 hours of captivity, followed minute by cameras, reporters, helicopters, and live broadcasts. As I watched, it became increasingly clear that something was terribly wrong. The police seemed to hesitate, the media pushed every possible boundary, and the aggressor, Lindenberg Fernandez Alves, 22 years old, began to be treated almost like a reality TV character, with microphones pointed at him and negotiations carried out in front of the cameras. At the center of everything was Eloá Cristina Pereira Pimentel, a 15-year-old girl. A teenager with dreams, fears, desires, and an entire life ahead of her. Eloá was not only a hostage to her captor, but to an entire system that failed to protect her. The outcome was tragic. After days of tension and questionable decisions, Lindenberg invaded the room and fired shots. Eloá did not survive. He was arrested in the act, but the feeling of injustice never left the air. The documentary Eloá Case, Live Hostage, which premiered on Netflix, revisits this episode 17 years later and forces me to relive every detail with a new perspective, more critical, more human, and even more painful. The film does more than simply recount the events. It exposes the glaring failures of the police response, the irresponsible role played by parts of the media, and how the pursuit of ratings helped turn a real crime into a true media circus. What impacts me the most in the documentary are the excerpts from Eloá's personal diary. Hearing her words makes it impossible to see only the victim portrayed in headlines. There is a real teenager there, with deep emotions, trying to understand an abusive relationship and a reality that was crushing her. The family's perspective adds even more weight to the narrative, revealing the lasting pain of those who lost a daughter and never received enough answers. When revisiting the Eloá case, I don't see just a brutal crime. I see a turning point for reflection on femicide, domestic violence, the spectacle of suffering, and institutional irresponsibility. It is a cruel reminder that when life becomes entertainment, the price is almost always paid by the victims, and in this case, by a girl who never had the chance to grow up. Directed by Chris Gattas, the documentary unfolds the events in chronological order, and I experience the story through the extensive archive built by the press at the time of the crime. From the very first hours of the kidnapping, television crews rushed to the residential complex and never left. For more than 5 days, they remained there, broadcasting non-stop, while 4 teenagers were held hostage at gunpoint inside Eloá's own apartment. As I watch the film, it becomes impossible to ignore how early the media inserted itself into the heart of the tragedy. Cameras were already rolling while the situation was still unfolding, turning a life-or-death crisis into continuous coverage. During those long days, the apartment stopped being just a home and became a stage where fear, tension, and uncertainty were exposed to millions of viewers in real time. The documentary also forces me to confront the harsh criticism directed at both the press and the police. In their pursuit of exclusive information and higher ratings, journalists crossed ethical boundaries, directly interfering in police negotiations by placing phone calls to the kidnapper. What should have been a carefully controlled operation became a chaotic exchange influenced by the presence of microphones, live broadcasts, and the constant pressure to deliver breaking news. From my perspective, the film makes it clear that this interference was not just a background detail, but a central element of the tragedy. The line between reporting and participation was dangerously blurred, and the consequences of that failure still echo years later. When I look back at the Eloá case, I don't see just a crime that ended in tragedy. I see a collective failure on almost every level. In my view, what happened in Santo André was not only the result of one violent individual, but the consequence of a system that completely lost control of a situation where a young girl's life should have been the absolute priority. What disturbs me the most is how quickly the line between information and entertainment disappeared. From the moment the cameras arrived, the kidnapping stopped being treated as a delicate police operation and became a live spectacle. I believe the media played a decisive and deeply irresponsible role. By broadcasting negotiations, calling the kidnapper directly, and competing for exclusive details, journalists transformed a hostage crisis into a reality show. In doing so, they didn't just report the story, they became part of it. From my perspective, this constant exposure empowered the aggressor. Lindenberg was no longer acting in the shadows, he had an audience. He was seen, heard, and treated as if his emotions and opinions deserved airtime. I strongly believe that this visibility fed his ego and escalated his behavior. A man holding teenagers at gunpoint should never have been given a platform, yet microphones and cameras followed his every move. The police response also leaves me with a deep sense of frustration. I understand that hostage situations are complex and unpredictable, but hesitation, lack of coordination, and the apparent tolerance of media interference created a dangerous environment. In my opinion, the operation lost its authority. Decisions that should have been made swiftly and firmly were delayed, while the risk to the victims grew with every passing hour. At the center of all this chaos was Eloá, a 15-year-old girl whose life was reduced to headlines, breaking news alerts, and television ratings. When I think about her, I don't think about statistics or timelines. I think about a teenager trapped not only by an abusive ex-boyfriend, but by a society that failed to protect her privacy, her dignity, and ultimately her life. She deserved silence, protection, and professionalism, not exposure under the unforgiving glare of cameras. In the end, the Eloá case represents a painful lesson about how badly things can go wrong when ethics are ignored. It forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about journalism, public safety, and responsibility. How far should the media go in the name of information? At what point does coverage become exploitation? And who is held accountable when that line is crossed? In the end, I believe this case should never be remembered merely as a shocking crime. It should be remembered as a warning, a reminder that lives are not content, suffering is not entertainment, and the pursuit of audience numbers should never outweigh the value of a human life. Eloá's story still echoes today because it exposes truths we are often unwilling to face, and because forgetting it would mean allowing the same mistakes to happen again. And for me, the most painful part of the story is knowing that Eloá's death was not inevitable. I believe there were countless moments where a different decision, a firmer stance, or a more responsible approach could have changed the outcome. That is what makes this case so haunting. It carries the weight of what could have been prevented. Her life did not end because there were no options. It ended because those options were mishandled. I also think about how this case shaped the way we discuss femicide and domestic violence today. Eloá was already living inside a cycle of control and emotional abuse long before the kidnapping began. In my opinion, society failed to recognize the warning signs early enough, and when the situation escalated, it responded with spectacle instead of protection. This is why her story still matters, because it reflects patterns that continue to repeat themselves. Personally, I believe the Eloá case should be mandatory study material for journalists, police forces, and anyone involved in crisis management, not as a source of sensationalism, but as a case study in ethical failure. It shows how the absence of clear boundaries, discipline, and responsibility can turn coverage into interference and intervention into tragedy. When I reflect on this case today, I don't feel closure. I feel responsibility. Responsibility to remember Eloá not as a headline, but as a person. Responsibility to question how stories are told, who profits from them, and who pays the ultimate price. And above all, responsibility to ensure that future victims are protected with silence, respect, and competence, not exposed under the unforgiving glare of cameras. In the end, Eloá's story is not just about what happened inside that apartment. To me, it is about what happened outside it, in newsrooms, command centers, and living rooms across the country. And it is precisely because of that collective involvement that her case still demands reflection, accountability, and change.